Today, I'm delighted to be joined by three of the most prominent and eloquent and powerful advocates for Ukraine in the UK. I'm delighted to welcome back three people who've been on the channel before, but this is the first time we gather this ensemble together of, dare I say it, sort of superheroes in one place. Shaun is a former British soldier and Ukrainian Marine. He's written an extraordinary first-hand account of the war in Ukraine, his capture, imprisonment, and torture by the Russian invaders. Mesa Gifford is a British veteran of the Ukrainian army whose dispatches from the front lines of this conflict were of tremendous value, highly engaging, informative, eloquent, and full of humanity. Jonathan M.S. Pearce is a philosopher, author, columnist, and public speaker. He's also a former teacher and is now battling primary progressive multiple sclerosis. He made a remarkable and arduous journey to Ukraine's front lines earlier this year to see what was happening for himself. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, and all that usual good stuff. Make sure you don't miss any future episodes by setting up notifications and, of course, making sure you subscribe and check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It's incredibly important that we help Ukraine to remain resilient, both on the military side, but also civilian side as well. Gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to the channel.
It's good to be here.
Pleasure to be on.
Thank you for the invite. If ever I feel bad about myself, I just listen to your introductions and just feel good about life again.
Yeah.
No,
Superheroes, I never got past that.
Well, let's start with Kursk, because this seems to have not only re-energized the Ukrainian activist community, we're certainly seeing a spike in interest online for those who are engaged in this kind of YouTube game. Kursk is a hot topic. For those who are closely associated with the struggle, as you guys are, I'm sure this provides a wealth of information on a daily basis. But we have to ask, as bold as this strategy is, what are the reasons behind it? What are the objectives? Because some have been stated publicly. For instance, create a buffer zone. I think that from Zelensky was a slightly ironic dig, because Putin wanted to create a buffer zone on Ukrainian soil. So that's, yes, it's a buffer zone, but I think that's sort of mocking partly. One reason that has been mentioned, I think, is rather more serious, is the ability to create a bank of Russian POWs to have leverage to exchange Ukrainian POWs. But I'm sure you wouldn't mount an operation of this scale simply to do that, or simply to improve your negotiating position for later in the year. There must be a whole range of reasons. So I'd be really keen to hear what you guys think might be the strategic objectives behind this. Let's start with Shaun.
Well, I've been keen like you, following this from the word go. I mean, it was totally unexpected. For those that don't know, I teach an English-speaking group in Dnipro now, and so I live in Dnipro. I'm on the ground there all the time. The general consensus was really a lot of apprehension, really, when this really started. I was put on my Twitter feed, "Don't get too excited about this. Don't. We have no idea how long they're going to be in there for." How long it will, whether it was a quick raid or a dash in, or whether actually something strategic or bigger was going to happen. And like you said, I don't think POWs, you wouldn't launch an operation like that. I think largely it's probably down to being in a better position. Remember, Putin was calling for peace regularly, wanted talks, pushing that through different channels. What you're not seeing is that now. Those channels have stopped. He's even gone as far as said he's not going to discuss any more peace with Ukraine. It was never a peace deal he presented. It was capitulation of Ukrainian land and people, land that he didn't actually have. And it wasn't any sort of serious peace offered by Putin. So now we're looking at sort of how many days, 15 days, 16 days in now. I think we're now seeing that, it could be the start of a strategic masterpiece, really, giving us a better chance of gaining, if peace talks do come around, gaining land back that we've lost. Also, what you've got to read, a lot of the apprehension based on this offensive in Kursk was largely down to problems with Russia making inroads into Ukraine, taking ground at Provozhsk and places like that. So, you know, there's a lot of places that need support and rebuffering and rotation. Don't get me started on mobilization. That's just another topic that's been in my opinion, a debacle from the word go. But yeah, I mean, it's now panning out. We're seeing it sort of progressed into something more stable and more. Now they're digging in, so we have to just see how far that goes.
Mesa, let's turn to you because let's turn to Mesa because you've been involved in all sorts of reconnaissance missions. You've been involved in planning many missions. Now, the scale and scope of this must have required meticulous planning, not just from the stages that we've seen so far, but potentially for subsequent stages that we can only speculate about. What's been your impression so far about this sort of planning that must have gone into it, the extraordinary secrecy that surrounds it, but also maybe the potential objective?
Well, I think when it comes to the objectives, I don't think there's actually a wrong answer here, because I think the Ukrainians have been rolling with the punches almost. They would have, it's been a difficult summer. Over the last few months, a brutal war of attrition has kicked off in the east of Ukraine. The Russians have made progress by sheer numbers and by force of arms. They've been the disadvantage, particularly in artillery, has been sort of devastating, and it's so frustrating that the Americans delayed for so long the crucial support that Ukraine needed. What I think happened here was a little bit of out of the box thinking, blue sky thinking. And not only could this have been, I think the best way to describe this is, I think they had an A plan, a B plan, a C plan, and a D plan. As I said, they rolled with the punches. They thought to themselves, if all this is a big raid on the Russians where we can just trash their front line, perhaps take a few prisoners and all the rest of it, let's just see what happens. And then have a plan B if we actually do break through, a plan C if we actually really do make progress or whatever. And I think, I think all the analysis that we've been doing over the last couple of weeks has all been right. I genuinely think a red line has been crossed here. I do think this is going to encourage the West, Britain, America, others, to keep supporting Ukraine. I think it's embarrassed Vladimir Putin. I think the capture of all those Russian prisoners has been a great thing as well. It restocks our ability to trade those prisoners. There's a lot, and Shaun will talk much more in detail about this, there's a lot of Ukrainian prisoners that have been in prison for over 2 years now. And our ability to trade for those people is crucial from a humanitarian perspective, as well as a sort of a military perspective. So I genuinely think that as long as we now take advantage of what's happening in Kursk, perhaps expand the bridgeheads. They've hit the bridges crossing the river. They want to take more prisoners, widen the offensive, and then just trade ground for lives on Russian soil. Instead of doing that in the east on Ukrainian soil, take the fight to the Russians and bleed them out there, and show everyone the world that Ukraine can still win, basically.
I pretty much agree with what everyone said, and just following on from what Mesa was saying, yeah, definitely. So I would strip it back and say, right, this for me is about wresting initiative back from Russia. So how do you do that? There are going to be metrics of success for Ukraine in whatever they do. And those metrics of success are very different to the Russians. The Russians are interested in territory and territory alone, I think, really. And that's why they're willing to expend so much manpower and material. For the Ukrainians, they know that they value life, I think, intrinsically more, but also life is more valuable in terms of being in shorter supply. So therefore, whatever they do, they have to do it with minimal casualties and minimal material losses. And when it comes to Kursk, the great thing there is, so yeah, if you're going to wrest back initiative, where do you attack? Where do you have a maneuver? What do you do? Where on the front lines? Now, remember, this is in tandem, I think, with a strategy of hitting Russia from a distance, and I think this is super important. So again, if your metrics of success are not losing soldiers, you need to use missiles and drones as much as you can. And we are recording this at the moment where Kavkaz port is burning. Like there's some serious oil burning there. Rostov oil depot has been burning for 5 days. You've had a massive strike on an airbase last night, following on from striking all the way up in Murmansk and Moscow. I think this is part of the all systematic approach to this kind of whack-a-mole game. Now, if you're talking about, okay, so we also have to do something on the ground. If we have to do something on the ground, where should we best do it? Like Kursk, we are losing in Kursk. Let's throw all of those troops into Kursk. That will be insanely attritional, and you might defend and stop the Russians from advancing further, but at quite a cost. So I think that the conclusion was you look at all along the front line in Ukraine and think anywhere we attack there will be massively attritional. They've got fortifications built all over the shop. How about we attack into Kursk, where they are weak, where the fortifications are poor, where there are only conscripts and border guards, and where we weren't they're not expecting it, and supposedly General Lapan, who is not a very good general, who's in charge of the Kharkiv offensive for the Russians, has also weakened the Kursk front as well, supposedly. So we go in, we take loads of land, and by the way, we might take loads of prisoners, but I don't think, like you guys are saying, that was up front a variable. But you have all these A, B, C, and D, and you take as much land as possible for the fewest amount of casualties. And this is a game of military chicken. So Russia are advancing in Pokrovsk, Ukraine are advancing in Kursk. Who will capitulate first? Who will start crumbling first? The Russians are not going to take troops away from Pokrovsk because that's the most success they're having. So they're stripping everywhere else, as well as stripping conscripts away from different areas within Russia. And I think this is very sensible. So the big question is, yes, it's about buffer zones. Yes, it's about embarrassment. Yes, it's about wresting back initiative and exchange fund and negotiations and exchanging territory. The question, I think the most important question now is, where now? So what do you do once you've got all that land? Do you defend all of it, move back to better defenses, get out of Dodge completely and just say, hey, look what we did, and then go back to Ukraine? If Russia are able to mount a massive counterattack, the question then is, are they able to do that?
There's lots of directions we could take there. I think we need to touch on Belarus later as well, because my suspicion is there's going to be interesting things going on there too. Before we head on to that, before we touch on the very important topic of prisoners, I'd be interested to hear your points of view on the mobility of the warfare, because Mesa mentioned plans A, B, C, and D. Now, if you're the lumbering hierarchical Russian army, where you need orders from, your local commander or even Moscow before you go and do anything, you can't work a maneuver warfare strategy. You can't work a plan A, B, C, and D, because your guys on the ground don't have the initiative to make those decisions. Are we seeing evidence here of these years of Western training in combined arms, but also sort of devolved responsibility down, NCO Corps, all these things? Are we seeing these things really starting to play out in this operation? And how important is it that Ukraine has decided to create a mobile battlefield rather than be forced into fighting the attritional war only, which not only adversaries seem to be wanting to force them into, but also for the last 2 years, allies as well? Let's start with Mesa on this one.
Well, yeah, I'll just build on what Jonathan said, actually, when he said about what happens next. So what we saw in the early stages of this operation is a front line largely constructed by conscripts and staffed and manned by conscripts. You had a secondary line of Chechens, which apparently fled, not before turning away the conscripts and sending them back towards eventual either death or capture by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have smashed through this front line, and what happens next is now the big question. It's this operation, as far as I'm concerned, it's for the Ukrainians to lose at this point. And what I mean by that is, if they left tomorrow, then this was a successful raid, as far as I'm concerned. They did all the good things that we mentioned a second ago. If they push too far, if they extend their lines too far, if they lose too much ground in the east, and the plan to draw reserves and Russians away from other parts of the front line completely fails, and this is to their disadvantage, then again, the amazing success that we've seen over the last couple of weeks will start to turn bitter in our mouths a little bit. But I think that now that they're pushing east along the river, they've blown the bridges. They're trying to widen the front line. They're going to use the terrain of Russia to, as I said, slowly give ground, and maybe when they get to that culmination point, once they get to the point where they can't push anymore, and once they're happy with the amount of land that they've taken, they may actually start taking several thousand troops away from that front line and push them back towards the east, and then use existing troops, let's say just the 22nd mechanized or something, just to hold that ground and to slowly give it up. But it's but to answer you, I really don't know what the future holds, but it'll just be interesting what, as Jonathan said, what the Ukrainians do next.
Can I just add to that? Because actually something I forgot to mention as well in my massive bunch of words was that actually there are possibly also some very important strategic gains, or operational or tactical, or however you want to see it on whatever scale. Things like Sudzha is a town that has some seriously important railway logistics, and they've got hold of possibly computers that give and paperwork that give you intelligence on the operation of the Russian rail network. So it's not just land and people and attrition, but there also could be some very important aspects to the territory that they are taking. And further to that as well, I mean, you can only do maneuver warfare, to your question, Jonathan, you can only do maneuver warfare in Russia. You can't do that along the front lines. The fortifications are too heavy and the drone coverage is too much. You just can't do it. So this is the only place you can do that. So I think that's super important. So as to where we're at now, I don't know. I think no one knows actually, and it kind of partly also depends on what the objectives are. Like where you go from here depends on actually what were your intentions. And the brilliance of this is that nobody quite knows. Whereas it seems every other thing that both sides have done has been quite obviously telegraphed, whereas there's been a lot of operational security, a lot of OPSEC here that has left people guessing, and that's brilliant, and that's what the Ukrainians want. Because there appears to be no surprises left in this war until surprises come along, because drones are covering everything. You can't do surprise moves. What was great about this area is that they were able, under the cover of claiming that the Russians were going to attack down into Sumy from Kursk, because they could amass some forces and say, so the Russians would then think, oh, the Ukrainians are doing that because they're afraid of us, when actually what they were doing were amassing forces for a surprise attack on the Russians. And I think that's supremely clever. Anyway, over to you, Shaun.
Oh, well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I don't know where to start. So I'm going to limit myself really to the first bit that about Mason was talking about standard of troops. Remember, I was there in 2008 doing these joint exercises with the Marines and National Guard in America, in Aleshki. And those guys are either, like Mason said, captured, been in there for 2 to 3 years, or dead, or missing, or injured. So you've got a lot of problems there with the Ukraine military having those guys. The only training they've had is really going to somewhere like England and doing their infantry training for maybe 2-3 weeks, maybe a month if they're lucky, maybe do some specialist training after. But tactically, those guys that have been fighting the war are still fighting the war, and they've been on the front lines for 2 years. Like myself, some of them were fighting when it was the ATO, and they don't want to come off the front lines because they know the standard of troops are very bad coming through. So I don't want to be the killjoy in all this, but you have to take the good with the bad. Yes, we've made some progress into Kursk. Yes, we're doing very well. Yes, we've got them regained the initiative, which is so hard to do after 12 months of no shells. You have no idea how regaining initiative in any battle costs men. And a lot of the problems we have now,
I think that could only be done in Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's what I can't remember who said it, but the bypassing of the defense and actually coming around behind it, moving through Russia was a lot easier. And who gave us that idea? Prigozhin. How quick did he get to, 200 kilometers into Russia with no resistance whatsoever. So
Yeah.
those things were, ideas were coming down from other people, and they've done very well at it. But we still, the biggest fear is still the ground we're losing in Ukraine. Have we got the troops? Are we going to get another shortage of ammunition? What happens in November when Trump comes in? Is it all going to change again? Are we sufficiently prepared for a war with Russia inside Europe? Over to you guys. I mean, those questions we're asking now. And like you said, the last 12 months was dismal. We didn't even know if we were going to have a Ukraine. And the horror stories coming off the front lines because of the shell shortage. We called it a shell hunger by the time we actually got the deal done. And then you've got 7 months of the logistics before you actually get, the shells in place after that year long of no shells. And people don't realize how long that takes. So really, we're still in the unknown with this element or this phase of the war, really. But like Churchill said, I'll end on what Churchill said. We're not at the beginning, we're not at the end, but we're definitely at the end of the beginning.
There's one other aspect about the Kursk initiative that I think is really important. So if the Ukrainians are going to say, right, we're going to have some battles somewhere, right? Where do we choose to have all our battles? Wherever you choose it along the Ukrainian front line, you will do damage to Ukraine, right? So if we're going to say, right, let's go and have a fight up in Luhansk or in Toretsk or wherever, it's like Toretsk is going to get flattened. Okay, so if the Ukrainians are going to say, right, let's go and have a fight in Russia, then Russia, we heard yesterday, Russia dropped 27 bombs on their own country. Right, this is a really important added benefit of all the fighting is taking place in Russia. Everything that gets wrecked, from railway lines to logistics to houses and infrastructure, is happening in Russia. Who has to pick that up? Who has to sort that out? Who has to sort out the evacuation? All of those things that are entailed in any kind of war anywhere are taking place inside Russia, and that adds to this. I think the turning of the screw on Russia and on Putin himself and the Kremlin.
This is going to be my next question, really, was about the impact on the Russian mindset, because both Russian civilians and elites seem to have made their peace with the war, whether they're ignoring it, whether they're busy making money out of it. As long as it happened on Ukrainian territory, as long as it was Ukrainians who were suffering, Ukrainian cities that were being flattened, this seems to be a far more bigger psychological blow to Russians, to use a very sort of broad sort of sweep term there. But I think we massively underestimate the impact of this. The Tsar God, who is supposed to be infallible, who Russians have traded their freedom for security, essentially, when they chose Putin and chose to re-elect him over and over. Well, they have neither now. They have neither freedom nor security. I think this is a much bigger psychological blow. I think the Ukrainians understand that. Their allies perhaps do not. I'd love to hear your points of view on that. Who wants to jump in first?
Well, let me jump in because there is a lot to unpack. And I was thinking as you were talking, one thing I wanted to talk about was the Russian psyche, and also another factor that we briefly mentioned before, which is the red lines and sort of international sort of reaction to this incursion. But quickly starting with the Russian reaction, I actually was quite surprised to see the sullen faces of Russians just watching Ukrainian troops drive past them. If you were to go back to 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, you had people out in the streets, literally blocking the streets, forcing them back, old women saying to Russian soldiers, you might as well put sunflower seeds in your pockets, because so that at least the sunflowers can grow. And then instead you look at Russia, and I saw one interview with one Russian babushka who turned around and said, I don't know if this is Russia or Ukraine. I don't care. Because you've got to remember, Russia is a country which is horribly centralized. All the money goes first to Moscow and then is dished out like some autocratic fiefdom, dished out to all the people in the suburbs and whatever it's called, the provincials. And these people closest to the Ukrainian border are the very last people to get anything in Russia. they don't owe anything to Vladimir Putin. They don't owe anything to Russia. And if you saw an incursion on British soil, I don't know about you, but I'd be on the damn street, or I'd be calling for insurrection. The Brits just wouldn't stand for it. But the Russians, on a local level, don't seem to care. On an international level, they're sort of schizophrenic. One minute sort of saying, "Oh, it's all under control." The next minute, they're sort of saying, "This is outrageous," and a red line might have been crossed. But which also highlights the fragility of the whole system. It's because Vladimir Putin, this was a perfect time for him to call for another mobilization. He could have played off Russian patriotism if he believed it was there in the first place. He could have said, look, our country has been invaded. Let's all rally now and fight back. That's exactly what I would expect from a British Prime Minister. But obviously, Vladimir doesn't think that way. He thinks that my whole castle is built on sand, and I'm not so confident that the Russians will get behind me. I think one of the biggest things here, something that I know we've touched on, but I've got to reiterate, is the reaction of the international community. The fact that we have crossed this big red line. Russia itself has been attacked. Ukrainian boots are on the ground. We're driving into Russian cities. We're destroying Russian positions. And so it just makes the German position on long-range missiles that more silly. And stupid and ridiculous. The same with the Brits and with the Americans. So I'm genuinely hoping, and by the way, we have heard recently that Germany is going to cut its aid to Ukraine. We're also worried about the American elections that are coming up. Obviously, that was on the minds of the Ukrainians. I think the Ukrainians all along have said these red lines are not as solid as they might appear. And one of the reasons why they did this incursion was to remind the world that red lines can be crossed, and not to be fearful, and to have the courage that they have to challenge Russia. And that's the way this war will be won, if we keep pushing and fighting back, and be smart about how we fight.
100%. And they picked an area as well, Kursk. Ukraine has an influence there too. Many people there speak Ukrainian. So they weren't stupid about where they went in. They knew exactly where to go. The reconnaissance was good. The OPSEC was good. And that was quite the surprising thing. Even with the people I know on the front lines, I was saying, what's going on? They were going, we can't tell you. We can't. I've seen you, Mason. You had one, didn't you? Say, no, we don't talk to civvies. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So, it's pretty much the same for me now. So, trying to get information. I'm glad. I don't want to know until we've reached the objective. But yeah, I still keep going back to the fact that Russia's been losing over a long period of time. Yes, they've made small incremental gains, but let's remember they've lost over 50% of the land they initially took in the original invasion. That we've now knocked over 35% of the Black Sea fleet. They've now moved out the Black Sea. We've got safe passage, safe grain transport. We're actually nearly at the levels prior to the war, the full-scale invasion. So we're actually winning on a lot of levels, but unfortunately, the media, like you said, you watch the media, doesn't broadcast our successes as much as it does our failures and Russia's successes, and that is worrying. And you only have to see people on Twitter and social media, and I know I've never been one. I said to you, I've never been one for social media, but you only have to see them. They're now cheering when they liberate a town or a city in their own country of Russia. They're now saying, yes, we've driven back the invaders from and you're talking, we're inside Russia doing this. This is massive. It's so embarrassing for Putin. So embarrassing. I'll leave it up to you, Jonathan.
So much for Kyiv in 3 days, by the way. So much for Kyiv.
Oh, yeah. So much for Kyiv in 3 days. Where did that happen? And now we're invading Russia. And everybody has underestimated Ukraine from the very start, and they still do. They still do it. If we just had the gear, we've got the fight, the will to fight. No money in the world can buy that. No money, as Putin is finding out. So when your back's to the wall and you've got nothing else, the fight's there, and we still have that fight. We just want the equipment to be able to do it. Now we've got F-16. It's going to be incredibly harder as all this equipment starts to come in and mount up, and it's going to be incredibly harder for Russia to get any gains. But we could still be making them.
I wrote an article like in the first few days of the war when it was obvious that because it started out, and I'm sorry I've said this to your audience before, Jonathan, but it started out as a genuine special military operation. Like the Russians were thinking, we're just going to waltz into Kiev and we're going to change over the government, put in our puppet government, job done. And it turned into a war accidentally. And as soon as it turned into a war, they were not prepared for that because they didn't plan for a war. And that war then, you know, their initial SMO had maximalist intentions. So they were going to have their own puppet government, which meant by default they control the whole of Ukraine, right? So the maximalist gains were to control the whole of Ukraine. As soon as that transferred from an SMO to a war, they were unable to take the whole of Ukraine. So they couldn't work. So I wrote an article saying they've lost the war. Russia have lost the war. But the question is, can Ukraine win? So those are the two different things, right? So Russia can't win maximally. But then the question for Russia is like, what is a win for them now? And I don't know that anyone knows, and I'm not even sure Putin really knows, like, because I don't know what they can get away with. Right, they can't even go to Odessa, right? They can't take that land bridge to Transnistria, and that surely has to be one of their strategic goals now. If they're going to get anything out of this that's beyond what they have, then they need to control the coastline and control the exports from Ukraine and so on and so forth. And Odessa is such a key place, blah, blah, blah. But they can't do that. So every week we are seeing their military degrade, and every week we are seeing the Ukrainian military, in principle, upgrade. So they get every bit of equipment Ukraine are now going to receive will be an upgrade from a BMP-1, from a Soviet-era piece of kit, right? And so you get this constant upgrade for Ukraine and a constant degrade for Russia, and that is happening every single week. And so for me, like this is for us to help Ukraine properly win this. Now, will they get their 1991 borders back? I don't know. And this is going to the bigger ideas. But whatever Kursk is, it is going to be an attempt to maximize Ukraine's ability to get the best out of this situation they can. Now, for a lot of people looking on, you guys were talking about the psyche of the West. I think people just look at maps and go, well, Russia controlling lots of Ukraine, therefore Ukraine are losing, without understanding what Ukraine is doing inside Russia, what the sanctions are doing, the economic impact on Russia, the hydrocarbons, their pariah status around the world, you know, who are their friends, who aren't their friends. Oh, well done, North Korea's your mates. Good effort. They're being crushed in so many ways, militarily, economically, politically, as you know, logistically. That I always think about like a pyramid of objectives for Ukraine. It could be different for Russia, but for Ukraine, the objectives are 1991 borders, which is territory. But to get territory back, sometimes you lose territory. Or like so underneath that, there are other objectives that you need, which is not losing troops, attriting the enemy, not losing materiel, taking out Russian logistics, protecting your own logistics, protecting your own cities. All of these things sit under that and under that. And we're still operating around here. Now, will you get to this overall objective of getting the 1991 borders back? I don't know. But at the moment, they're trying to maximize as much of these things, these sub-objectives, as they possibly can.
One of these objectives, quite possibly, almost certainly not the main one, but one of them is to trade Russian prisoners of war, conscripts, as Mason and Shaun mentioned earlier, and the fact that these conscripts, poorly equipped, poorly trained, far less motivated, but maybe a little more willing to countermand orders or run away into the forest. It's showing, how weak Russia is. But let's turn to the prisoner thing, because a recent report suggested that 95% of Ukrainians who are held by Russia have, to some extent, rather been tortured. In many cases, is actually the more serious, intense end. And we see pictures of them emerging emaciated, which is a very visceral reminder, really, of how the Germans treated prisoners of war from armies that they, countries that they thought of as Untermenschen, and obviously how the Japanese treated the British and everybody else. You could talk directly to this, Shaun. How important is it for Ukraine to get their people back? And might what's happening in Kursk actually aid that process?
Well, you do. Firstly, it's highly important. A lot of the guys, especially just take my platoon and my battalion, is still captivity now into year 3. Some of them won't make it out year 3 because it's systemic. the torture is systemic, driven from the highest levels of the Kremlin. And that results from the initial capture, from myself being stabbed in the leg, through to being beaten, and then electrocuted, and then starved for around sort of 60 days before then they realized we might have some value, which then I was exchanged for Victor Medvedchuk. So then they started to fatten me out. By the time I got home, I was still only 60 kilo. So you know, we're only talking a bit of fish and a bit of grain. These guys have been here 3 years and they're coming out emaciated. And I personally don't think we were treated any different to the Ukrainians. We were treated probably worse because we were mercenaries. I always thought spies was the worst job to get captured on, but I was told Yomnik and mercenary was far worse than that. So, you know, we were considered mercenaries, not just mercenaries, but then put on a fake trial, which you're getting a lot of those Ukrainians going through now, being sentenced for what, 23, 24 years for not actually leaving their own country and defending it. You know, so these guys are getting in prison for years. They won't come out unless they're exchanged. And one of the good things I kept saying about before the Wall Street Reporter was exchanged was the fact that it actually had been trialed, because what happened to me was I was explained that to go home you have to be trialed, and that is one of the sort of positive aspects, that something could be in the wind about exchanges if you've been trialed. So I was really ecstatic when he actually got exchanged, because I was sort of saying on Twitter, don't worry, keep positive, he might be coming home soon, because that's quite a good thing to spot. But you know, it's very important to get these guys home, and you know, not just Azov, but my brigade are still there. They won't let them go because my brigade, like I said earlier, were doing the joint exercises. They're hardcore, regular soldiers. The proper 1st Battalion of Marines, the iconic battalion that was in Crimea when Russia invaded then. So they were highly trained and worked with NATO troops on joint exercises. So the only way we're going to get them back is conscripts, and conscripts in Russia are the same as Ukraine. When you start taking conscripts as prisoners of war, there's going to be a real problem in Russia, you know, revolving around that. Why are our kids on the front lines? How comes, you know, these kids are being taken as prisoners? They're probably wondering how, if you understand Russian propaganda like I was understood Russian propaganda when I was in prison, they're probably wondering how on earth inside their own country and they're now being on their way to Kiev, being captured by Ukrainian soldiers, because the propaganda there is just dreadful. And even when I was in prison, they were complaining about the negativity, you know, of the Russian propaganda there. So it's very high. I think we will see some exchanges. And from what I've read, it's the first time in a long while that Russia has actually initiated talks on prisoner exchanges, which should tell you everything.
But it's really interesting. The idea that, well, the whole Kursk initiative, invasion, attack, whatever you want to call it, is so clever on so many levels. And one of them is the fact that the 80% of the prisoners they're taking, it appears from one statistic, are conscripts. And the great thing about conscripts, and I know that there are some conscripts that we understand are still suffering from Russian propaganda, but most of the kind of volunteers and mobilized Russians are told that if you are captured, you will be tortured. Don't get captured. It is better to kill yourself. So you're getting a lot of suicides from Russian soldiers because they are genuinely afraid of being captured, because they think the Ukrainians are monsters, right? And the reality is they're not. And with conscripts, I was wondering, and this is pure speculation, but these are younger people. So these are 18-year-olds or whatever who are going into their year of national service. So the training is poor. They're also, the morale will not, they're not joining because they want to go to war against Ukraine. They're being forced to join as part of what they have to, and then they're ending up on a war. So their morale is lower. They were also, being younger, they probably got a better grasp of social media. They have VPNs, virtual private networks. So they probably have a greater understanding that actually we won't be tortured to death. Although there's a couple of conscripts that have said they were afraid of that. I think in the main, you've probably got a lot of people who have got low morale, low skill sets, poorly equipped possibly, and also know that they won't be tortured if they're captured. And so therefore, if you've got a Ukrainian unit coming towards you, you're like, but you know what? Yeah, I'm all right with this.
Yeah.
Like, and then we know we've got a load of Ukrainian prisoners, so you know I'll end up being swapped. I get an okay time in prison, because I've seen videos on Telegram and Signal and wherever else that the Ukrainians keep their prisoners pretty well, and so I'm up for being taken prisoner.
I think that's an incredibly important point. I think this is one of the reasons Putin has not gone for mobilization of the urban population. If he's going to dislodge Ukraine, I think he's going to have to go for that. But he knows that's a real red line for his regime. That's a real throw of the dice there. I think that's one of actually the key reasons why Ukraine has launched this offensive. I really think this is the game of poker they're playing here. No, come on, if you really want to take us on, we know what you have to do. And he's sort of he's balked at doing that.
Sorry, is that to
yes.
say? Sorry, so just a question, to make sure I understand what you're saying. Is that to say that you think Ukraine are wanting Russia to mobilize? Because actually, because I've long said that mobilization, you would do it if you could without a problem. You would if you could. You answer you can't, and they can't mobilize because that will cause such an issue that you would get internal protests and it breaking down. A bit like maybe they're hoping with the conscripts. You take too many conscripts as prisoners, then it's a bit like Afghanistan. If you send them back in body bags, or you take these conscripts prisoner, then you get a lot of families getting up in arms and discord internally.
I think the body bags is the sort of medium-term effect, and it takes a long time for that feedback loop. So Putin, I think, is probably less afraid of protests. What he is probably afraid of is conscripts just throwing down their weapons en masse, as we've already seen some of that taking place, or fleeing for the borders, hiding. That would have a seismic shock on the economy. So I think there are short-term consequences to that, as well as medium and long-term. And I think he's got some awareness of those. And as you say, if these people have got VPNs, and if they have been watching, now, for the Ukrainians in the audience here, I'm not necessarily, condoning Russian liberals, etc., but there is a vibrant broadcasting network from the diaspora. Michael Nack, Dost, and others, they produce videos on a daily basis, and they do, as you say, show pictures of Russian POWs being relatively well treated. And they also implore Russians, if they are sent to the front, not to fight and kill Ukrainians, but to surrender. So as you say, if they have VPNs, if they're a young generation, they will have seen some of these videos, no doubt. So it's finally, that diaspora network might actually prove to have some kind of use. But Mesa, what's your view on the whole prisoner exchange thing, and what are Ukraine's priorities vis-a-vis getting their people back?
Well, I think what's so upsetting about what the Russians tend to do with everything, not just with prisoners, is to politicize it. To build on what Shaun said, he was used by them as a political tool. Azov as well. Azov, for them, they like to portray Azov as a symbol of the entire Ukrainian state. That literally, all of Ukraine is a Nazi state, and they're playing on their deep-rooted sort of patriotic war, sort of cultural affinity to that war, to sort of urge their population to keep fighting, to rid Ukraine of the evil Zelensky, despite him being Jewish and as far away from being a Nazi as you possibly get. But either way, it also concerns me, just to build on what I just said about it being politicized. I think very early on in the war, there was, as far as I was concerned, a fake HIMARS attack, I believe it was, on a prisoner of war camp, which killed a lot of prisoners. Is that?
Olenivka, yeah. 200 came to my prison shortly after. Told us what happened at Olenivka, yeah. Well,
it's just what I fear the most is that a lot of prisoners, possibly from a lot of them from Shaun's former battalion, a lot of Azov people, etc., a lot of them might already be dead. They might have been brutally tortured, and Russia has no intention of giving them up because it highlights how brutal they are and all the rest of it. So I'm very worried about their welfare, is what I'm trying to say. Again, if we can get enough conscripts, enough prisoners, maybe there is deals to be made, and we need to get these guys home. That's why I think that's very important for Ukrainian morale. I think it's very important for the experience of the troops that are there, and just everything. There's a number of different reasons. From the Russian perspective, when it comes to conscripts, there was the Committee of Soldiers of Mothers of Russia, I think it's called. They were a thorn in the side of the Russian state all through the sort of the 80s and 90s, with the war in Afghanistan and the war in Chechnya, with all those conscripts that died in those two conflicts. I think Vladimir Putin is genuinely worried also about conscripts from places like Moscow, St. Petersburg being put on the front line, dying in droves, being captured in droves, their mothers calling out for answers as to where their sons and daughters are. You're already seeing a little bit of it anyway. I don't know, over the last couple of years, I've seen a few stories where Russians have even gone to Western press, sort of saying, I'm being driven out of my mind with worry. I have not heard from my son in X amount of time. And there's been a real attempt by Russia to hide the losses. Very early on in the war, we saw the mobile crematoriums that they were using to literally burn the bodies so that there wasn't streams of coffins coming back into Russia. On top of that, they wouldn't even admit that the Moskva went down. And then they did a propaganda piece where only about a third of the ship's company actually went on parade, but they still made out that this is the full ship's complement. Where in reality, the evidence suggests that dozens and dozens of sailors, including conscripted sailors, died on the vessel. So Russia is just terrified of the sort of the political and social backlash from getting conscripts. As I said earlier, Vladimir Putin genuinely thinks that that although he puts on a solid face and a solid front and a united front, as all dictators do, it's all built on sand. If these people want to throw their lives away for the oligarchs, then more for them. But I think Vladimir Putin is going to have a very difficult 2025, and I think that's the big thing that we're going to start talking about very, very soon as the rains and the weather starts to change.
I think that the screws have been turning for a long time now, and turning in ways that maybe the mainstream media don't really realize, or they report it over here, like doing a bit on the economy of Russia over here, and a bit on the war front over here, and a bit on politics over here. But actually joining all of this together, you understand that there must be so much pressure building up on the Kremlin, I think. But on the bodies front, it is interesting. I reported the other day on a video that I saw of an SUV driving along a track with a Russian SUV full of body bags with bodies in, and someone in the back kicking the bodies off onto the road. And they were literally dispersing bodies. And you hear so often that the Russian commanders don't want to report their losses to their superiors for kind of reporting reasons. Like, I look weak if I show that I've got X amount of dead, so therefore I don't report the dead. But then what happens is they are dead. I either haven't picked them up off the battlefield, or I've picked them up and then lost them. So that's a reporting thing. But then you have pressures in all different areas. So then there's a pressure on the MOD not to have so many dead, because they don't want to pay families compensation. So they much rather list them as missing than dead. And then we've just heard today, I did a report in one of my videos this morning of in Kursk, they can't afford to repatriate the bodies, because now the payment for the repatriation of the bodies, they get flown to this particular airport, Bratsk Airport, I think, and then the 300 kilometers from there to wherever these people actually are from, they can't afford to do that, and it's now coming out the education budget for that region, and you're like, the education budget is like, we got no money left. So this again, it shows that the screws are turning, that there are so many pressures, that finances are not good, that this war is taking away from welfare, from education, from everything else that helps a country to run. And they can't afford to get the bodies back home. So there are all these pressures on not reporting and on the financial implications of having people die, that they're just leaving many of them on the battlefield. And then the follow-on question from that should be then, well, does Putin know this? My question is always, how much does Putin know? Because and I've said this to you before many times, Jonathan, but he doesn't look at the internet, right? He's afraid of the internet. He thinks it's a CIA conspiracy. So he doesn't have a smartphone. So therefore, how does he check the figures? How does he check the information that people are giving to him? Well, he has to go back to people that are giving him information. So he lives in his own kind of bubble. Then how does he verify or disconfirm any information? How much does he really know? What is his knowledge like of the loss figures on the front lines, considering the commanders aren't even telling their superiors the loss figures. So, yeah.
I think that's an interesting one. It's a pyramid of lies, isn't it? It's not just, the small group of people around Putin that are telling him the truth. They're getting false information at every stage. And Belousov was appointed, I think, to give him a more realistic picture of the state of the economy, how many resources he's got that he could potentially, scrabble together. But after a few months, Belousov is now in the frame for the failures. So I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't start sort of, lying and falsifying as well. But basically,
just before you jump, look at what you did. Look at Gerasimov, how he dealt with Kursk. Sorry to jump in there, but look how he dealt with that. On that first 2 or 3 days of invasion, it's all under control. Where is he now? Gone.
I don't think Gerasimov really exists. So the idea is, sorry, I know Mason needs to speak, but Gerasimov was supposedly in a strike in Crimea, and he was not seen for like 3 months. Then he came back in when they were voting for the presidential election, and you could see him shuffle around with Shoigu, but not say anything. And then he's since been he's given out some medals to a couple of soldiers. He wasn't at a very important meeting that's just been had. He didn't go to meet Xi Jinping, the Chinese, with a whole load of people. And basically, Gerasimov, I think, has been injured to the point, or has had a heart attack, or there's some issue with him where he's basically not functioning. He's a commander-in-chief of the fricking Russian armed forces here, and he has been AWOL for the best part of a year. Anyway, sorry, Mesa.
No, well, I think it's all been said. Remind me, what was the last question, Jonathan? Did you ask me a question?
It was about prisoners. I mean, that topic was about prisoner exchange and the treatment of prisoners. I think I have one more question after this, but let's put this one to bed before we launch into the final question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Well, no, to be honest, there's not much more I can add in regards to the prisoner situation. I'm genuinely hopeful that Ukraine can make a huge success of the Kursk offensive, that they can build up a stockpile of prisoners to trade for the people that have been trapped for several years. And all eyes are on the Eastern Front to see if Russia can make any progress before the weather changes. And I think if Ukraine can weather the storm over the next couple of weeks, if it can hold the Russians back from places like Kramatorsk and other places and the rest of the Donbass, and then build upon what's coming from the West in terms of material, hopefully 2025 is going to be a better year.
How close do you guys think Russia is to being in serious trouble? I think they're covering up a lot. I think economically they're covering up a lot. But when we talk about conscripts, and the question that Jonathan asked was to do with partly to do with the Russian psyche, the Kremlin still has a really tremendously tight grip on information in Russia, right? And so there are still an awful lot of people who are happy to drink the Kool-Aid. So, what do you guys think of the reality on the ground? How close is Russia from its people up to the Kremlin and the cronies and the oligarchs? How close do you think we are to seeing Russia have some kind of big issue?
We still do speak to relatives in the occupied territories. We still have my wife's mum and dad still live in Crimea, and people we know still in the occupied territories. So generally, we know what's happening there. It's all lies. What's happening? 40% on basic inflation. We know that eggs have gone up, basic stuff has gone up. If you can't get any of that unless you take a Russian passport. So even basic medical is a problem. So we know they're struggling. Even when I was captured, the guys, my interrogators, were saying that we can't get stuff. It's going up. It's getting more expensive. While he puffs into an IQOS cigarette. So they're all lying about it. Then you hear about there's a 4 trillion budget deficit, ban on the export of sugar and petrol and things like that. I've been telling everybody for the last maybe 2 or 3 months, when we felt the wind of change, when we started to realize, hold on a minute, we're starting to get a sniff of, we've had such a bad 12 months, we're now starting to get a sniff of victory here. So when we started to 2 months ago, we started to get that sniff. We were asking these questions, and now people are sort of saying, how much has Russia got left? How much have they got left? I mean, they're spending a fortune on this war. So, yeah, we know that they're lying economically. And I've been telling everybody for months that you probably see more of the war and what's happening with the war from the different sectors that they're fighting now, like the financial sector, the political spectrum, you know, all those different areas where the war is being fought. You'll probably see more more effect there than you will on the battlefield. I didn't know they were going to invade Russia and go into Kursk. So, you know, you can't get it always right, but generally, I think, like you said, Jonathan, I think economically, I think Russia's really in the stuck. It's going to be even. I'm not an economist, but we just got family over there, lived next door to Russia for 8 years. We know the lies. I've seen the propaganda the other side. I've seen what happens. So I just think even when this war stops, they are still going to be the losers in this. With 40% of the GDP now being spent on the war, it's been spent on nothing for 3 years.
Agreed.
Yeah, no,
so they're going to be the biggest losers.
This is problems that Russian children are going to have to deal with for many more years to come. I'm very hopeful of things changing in 2025. And the reason for that is I genuinely think that the Russian economy is overheating. I think it's Russia's vast sort of purchasing power was always going to insulate its population from the worst effects of sanctions and everything else. But I think that there's a limit to that. I think we've seen a fall in tax receipts for the Russian state. We've seen a collapse in FX transfers, obviously US dollar being the most obvious. Even Chinese FX transactions are now being strained by these secondary sanctions. If you look at the economy, they already had a population crisis before, and with the huge amount of men being mobilized and volunteering to go off to fight in the war with these ridiculously overinflated salaries and compensation packages if they're wounded. Again, which is forcing the Russian state to spend tens of billions of pounds of its reserves into financing this war, which is just expensive in and itself. But then if you look at the production of the Russian manufacturing, its ability to produce new weapons, although artillery, they might be able to keep that up. I understand they're getting sort of gun cotton and gunpowders from like Kazakhstan and other places, and they're not going to run out of steel anytime soon. But in regards to the actual physical machines, the tanks, the armored vehicles, that sort of stuff, they're having to pull them out of their reserve stocks, refurbish them, and send them off to the front. The trouble is these stocks are dwindling, and this huge investment into refurbishing these tanks, sending them off to the front line, is driving an artificial increase in the gross domestic product of the country. And once that plateaus, once the country overheats and inflation grows, then I think the one Russian economist said recently that they're in uncharted territory. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to go down, but if you look at how the Soviet Union, a country bigger than modern Russia, a country with more resources than modern Russia, how their economy imploded, then I think it gives a good example of what could potentially happen to Russia. So I think time before, a year or two ago, time was on the Russians' hands. I generally am starting to think that things have started to reverse slightly, and time is on the Ukrainians' hands. And that's why you're seeing Vladimir Putin pushing goddamn hard to take as much of the Donetsk region as possible, and hoping that Trump will come along, and growing right-wing politics in Europe and Germany and France is going to weaken the EU, and eventually the Europeans and the Westerners run out of patience and money and urge and will to fight, because this is the greatest strength of the Russian state. It's always been this way for hundreds of years, is their ability to weather a storm. That's what this country is doing at the moment. Vladimir Putin does not care about how many people die in Ukraine. What he cares about is making progress and keeping hold of what he's taken. Because if he can't keep hold of it, then everything the war is built on is a lie.
So to bring this back to Kursk, then it's this game of military chicken where who will capitulate first. And I think you're absolutely right. So this is why you are seeing Russia throw everything and the kitchen sink at places like Kursk. It's like we have to just throw more troops in there because it's the only place we're succeeding at. And I think many in the West misunderstand the idea that Russia have an unlimited amount of manpower. So that, yes, they've got 140 million people versus 40 million people, less than that now, on both sides. But the thresholds are wildly different, right? So if you're a country that's invading another country, this is not an existential war. Okay, this is a war where it's some kind of frivolous expansionist activity of a narcissistic dictator, right? And so therefore, am I going to put my body on the line for that? Yeah, not really. I'm not too bothered. Actually, I was perfectly happy before we invaded Ukraine. And in fact, now things are worse. So yeah, not bothered. Whereas in Ukraine, it's like, yeah, do you want to put your body on the line for this? Yeah, that's the existential future of this country, my family, my friends. We are being attacked. This is my country. And so therefore, the threshold for when you're going to give up wanting to attack and then start, or wanting to fight and then start protesting, is vastly different between Russia and Ukraine. And so yes, Russia have a shed load more people, but those people are far less likely to want to sacrifice themselves for the goals of the Kremlin, whereas the people in Ukraine are far more likely to want to sacrifice themselves to the goals of existential future. Although, yeah, you're still going to get people draft evading and running away and all that. But I think, it can mislead people to think Russia are automatically going to win this because they've got more people.
Yeah. And I think what's the other bit of psychology, which I think Ukraine has understood, which we're only, those who are following it perhaps have understood it, but has shocked maybe some of our media and politicians, is that the invasion of Ukraine is existential to every single Ukrainian, and their loss of territory and people is. It's been shown that an invasion of Russia is not an existential threat to Russians because they really don't have empathy for each other. They're not a nation. They're a collection they're a population, not a nation.
And it's so big.
It's big, but they've been trained not to have empathy, not to have trust with each other.
Empire. It's the empire that never fell. That should have, just like the British Empire, it should have been forced to collapse a very long time ago, and we missed an opportunity there.
Well, the very last question, because I know this is incredibly precious time for you guys. So this is a sort of quick one. I always try to end these by focusing on Ukraine because that is the right and proper thing to do. We've had 2.5 years of escalation management where, unfortunately, the majority, I think, of Ukraine's allies have provided arms on the condition that they know where those arms are going, they know where those arms are going to be used, and they can more or less understand the impact of those arms. So no surprises, thank you very much. And there has been some signaling to Russia just to make sure nothing untoward happens, to sort of scare the Russians into pressing any red buttons or so on. Ukraine seems to have said, enough. We are not playing the escalation management game anymore. We're going to play our own game, and it's far more innovative, and we're not going to tell you what's going to happen next. This clearly, I think, will scare the Russians. It may be that Jake Sullivan, I don't know, some person has put it mildly in one interview that he's having kittens. I think the less polite version is he's soiling the bed, and the Jake Sullivan equivalent in Berlin too, maybe. But what's your view? Is Ukraine decided to fight in a way that benefits them and to ditch escalation management, even if allies are not yet ready to do so?
Who wants to take this on first?
I'll go.
Yeah.
Oh, no, go on, Jonathan. You go.
No. Well, yeah. I don't know if this was intentional. Like, you're trying to second guess what the objectives were for the Ukrainians, but it's very clever that this is a clear red line. And they did this with superb operational security, such that the Americans, according to themselves, did not know they were going to do this. So this invasion into Kursk. And so as a result, the Americans have been left forced to go, yeah, this was a good idea. Yeah, we support this. Bastards. And that's great. Now, I'm of the opinion, I follow American politics incredibly closely. I do videos on the American political scene and the campaigns going on at the moment. And there's been a sea change in the US. So I'm very confident. I don't want to derail this conversation, but I am confident that Trump will not get in now, or at least a damn sight more confident than I was. And that's really good for the future of support for Ukraine, because whichever way you look at it, I don't think you're going to get a lot of support from JD Vance and from Trump and those people around him, Trump's son, all the, Bannon and Stephen Miller and all these people around Trump. So I think if the if there are no serious hiccups in American political support for Ukraine, and given that actually there's bipartisan support once you get past the MAGA representatives, there's bipartisan support for Ukraine in the US. And if now that the European elections are out of the way and you've got some stability there, and now you've got the great thing, and if you guys haven't seen Mesa with Jonathan Fink and Paul Mason and the Lib Dem candidate in that panel discussion, absolutely fantastic.
Edward Lucas.
Yes, Edward Lucas. In the UK, we're so lucky that we are unified in our support for Ukraine. And so you do appear to have these long-term supports for Ukraine. I think the German thing isn't as much of a problem as people initially thought, and there are reasons for why they're looking at changing the way they do their budgeting and so on and so forth. But I think I'm confident, kind of like Mason was saying, like 2025 is looking all right, because I think you're going to get continued support where it matters for Ukraine. And if Harris Wolf's get in and they can get another supplemental package, then I think Russia are in serious trouble. But it's about, so sorry, and the final thing is, but mobilization, but Ukrainian boots on the ground.
Yeah. I'll jump in there because that's the biggest
and
concern
energy
for my English speaking class. It's massive, the mobilization. If you ask them what's the first thing, we do a podcast, Letters from Ukraine. I was jumping in on that, and we send them letters. We get them to write letters, and the biggest thing that always comes up is mobilization. Am I going to die in a meat company? Am I going to go to a bad commander? But then we're going to take things back a bit. You know, it's like for 7 months I've just sort of been saying about the wind of change and what's happening. I don't think Russia can win militarily at all. I've been saying that for a long period of time. We are always underestimated as Ukrainian soldiers. We always have been innovative. This is not new. And if we're going to go into Kursk, he's probably going to do that anyway. Look at what we've done with sinking the Black Sea Fleet, and we don't really have a conventional navy. So we've always been innovative and outside the box thinking, and that's generally what we've always been good at. It's just we're held back largely by a lot of press and bad media and Russian propaganda, which is untrue, which is why I got into social media in the first place, because when he was saying that everybody was like Nazis in Ukraine and Mariupol was like Brandenburg, I was like, hold on a minute, I lived there. That's not exactly the case. So it just wasn't like that. So that's why I got involved in sort of dealing with social media, because as a soldier, I couldn't do it as a soldier because I was fighting, but now I can. And now I can actually dispel those propaganda. So we've always been thinking outside the box. And the only way Russia are going to have success, they might have some mini breakthroughs. But if the two things that worry me is one, and I'll end on this, one is if Ukraine collapses internally, something happens to Zelensky, there's some sort of spontaneous combustion, or the West decides that it doesn't want to really supply and support Ukraine anymore. And those are the two big things that could see the downfall of Ukraine and spiral down. So, but I think we're way off that yet. So we're doing actually very well.
So last
Over
word
to you, Mesa.
Yeah, well, I think the Ukrainians, time and time again, have proven how resilient, how innovative, how brave they are. And when it comes to the incursion into Kursk and crossing another one of Russia's red lines, I think that once again, that's Zelensky's showing the world that his leadership, effectively, because as we said a second ago, for Russia, this war, if they lose, it will not destroy the Russian state. Russia will continue on. If Ukraine loses, as we said, Ukraine will cease to function as a state. So I don't think the nuclear button, despite however many times Vladimir Putin and others threatened to push it, or at least remind us that they've got it. I think they've reminded us a dozen times a week on average for the last 2 years. I don't think it's ever going to be possible, because they know once they push that button, it is over. It's done. Even one tactical nuclear weapon could either get a kickstart a terrible war that we all lose, or it could kickstart a terrible conventional military response from the West, including the United States, or it will completely eradicate overnight all support from China and other places that are currently propping up the Russian economy. And they will lose eventually. And not only will they lose eventually, but the chances of him ending up in a war crimes tribunal will increase substantially. So I just don't think he's ever going to go there. But the trouble is, the West, they don't, even if there's a 0.0001% chance of something happening, they go by those statistics, and unfortunately don't have the same courage than Ukraine. I'll just end on this. I genuinely think that this war has been intensely complicated. I think it's changed over time. I think the Ukrainians have adapted with each change. I think the rest of the world has slowly drip-fed weapons and has utterly failed to say to Ukraine, the world, and to Russia what they want to achieve and what they want to see happen in Ukraine. I think if that changes, if tomorrow we double down on our support for Ukraine, I think this war will end a lot quicker. Because as Shaun said, I don't believe that Russia can win this war. The trouble is, what I don't want to see is the war to stagnate and to drag on for any more length of time. So hopefully, if we're all serious about peace in Europe and in the rest of the world, hopefully the politicians will get their act together and do something about it.
So was it Joseph Borrell the other day in the EU, from the EU, said that expediting weapons to Ukraine is the quickest way to peace, which is, and it's been said a number of times, and it sounds kind of contradictory, but this war ends with us helping Ukraine much more than we presently are. And I think there'll be discussions ad infinitum, and the historians will look back on why the drip feeding was taking place. And it has been a major issue. Was it an intention to degrade Russia so fundamentally over time that could be achieved with drip feeding in a way that if we gave them everything they needed straight away and Ukraine won that war really quickly, then actually Russia wouldn't have been kneecapped. They wouldn't have been fundamentally catastrophically degraded. But this long protracted manner of fighting Russia will do that to Russia so that they can't come back and do this in a generation's time. Now, was that intentional, or were there other reasons why the drip feeding was taking place? You know, those are conversations. But I will finish on this, and you know, nothing to add from what Shaun and Mason said brilliantly. Just to go back to remind people that as successful as Kursk is being, and you can talk about maybe this is Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, maybe this is his last throw of the dice. Some people are saying that he wasn't, you know, things were going bad in the Donbass, that maybe this was his kind of really risky move that saves his bacon. Maybe I don't know enough about the ins and outs of that. But, you know, there are clever things happening, like attacking between units where you've got, is it the FSB? Is it the border guard? Is it conventional forces that the Russians, are they communicating well with each other? Well, it doesn't matter. We're going to go through the middle of them. And then, you know, they've achieved some really good things in Kursk. But let's not forget the Donbass. Things are really difficult in Toretsk, in New York, in the Pokrovsk direction. There are some serious issues for the Ukrainians, but I think it's, like I said at the beginning, it's a game of military chicken here. Who will remove their forces from either Pokrovsk or Kursk first? Who will do that? Who will be forced into capitulating first?
Or will the weather change and then both fronts stabilize?
Well, third option, false dichotomy. Yeah.
I'm hoping that because who knows what's going to happen with the US election. As you say, I'm also not convinced that I nearly said Vladimir Trump, which actually probably would be an appropriate thing to say. I'm not confident that Trump will win either. But either way, again, Ukraine can't rely on Trump losing. It's still got to improve its chances of a good negotiation if peace talks were to happen, let's say, for example. And I genuinely think that by seizing some ground in Kursk, if they can stabilize, they are bleeding ground, and it has been really tough in the east. But if the weather can change in the next couple of weeks, next month or so, then things might slow down significantly.
And actually, do you two know, Shaun and Mason, do you two know if, because my supposition is that the Ukrainians are, scare quotes, happy, they're not happy to cede territory to Russia in the Pokrovsk direction, but are they doing that back to, I think Toretsk and New York are a bit different, but in the Pokrovsk direction, they have more fundamental fortifications that they built while they were panicking in Avdiivka, and it all went a bit wrong. They had to start then building better fortifications. They had to do that much further back because you can't build fortifications right near the front line. So I think it's okay for the Ukrainians to cede territory there until they meet those massive fortifications that will require fewer troops to defend. And then the Ukrainians can sit in there. Again, Touretsk and New York's a bit different. And then, as you say, the weather changes, and actually the Ukrainians might be in a better position. People are worrying now because they're losing fields and villages, but actually in the whole scheme of things, that might not be as important as people think. And it goes back to my hierarchy of objectives, where one of your objectives is not losing troops. You can lose territory, so not lose troops, to then go and use those troops later on to regain that territory more effectively. So yes, territory is super important, but actually not always the most important at that given time.
I was fine. I've never been that far south. Kramatorsk and Sloviansk is the target of the Russians. I was up in Liman and sort of Crimea at the forest. And the defenses there were pretty damn solid. The Russians made almost zero progress for the 3 months that I was there, and as I said, I finished in December. Big wide open fields. Every time they were still using vehicles to push forward. We were in a drone team and we were blowing them up really successfully, and every time whatever survivors popped out of their burning tanks were then just hit by mortars and artillery, and they just ran off again. Behind us, there was a number of fortifications. There were layered fortifications behind us. So if there was ground had to be given and ceded, it was an uphill fight as well for the Russians, because we do have the high ground in Liman. Then there was places to fall back to. Again, I presume that's the plan for the Ukrainians in that area as well, that they're just going to bleed the Russians out. They don't want to give up ground, but if they are forced to give up ground, have a roll with those punches and then just buy time. Time is of the essence.
Well, I think we're probably out of time. Oh, Shaun, last word there.
No.
Out
I
of
was
time.
just going to agree. Sorry, I was just going to agree. I can't speak for the areas, but yeah, generally Ukraine's never. That's one of their tactics. Is they're very good at is falling back, using the geography, and then kill more Russians. So I'll finish on that extremely high note.
Good note.
This sets us up for future conversations. I think I'll only throw one little grenade into this, which is expect to see some interesting dominoes fall, I think, around Putin as his power weakens. I think we're going to see some really interesting things. And a US intelligence report came out this week basically saying that the war had come to a stalemate. Given their predictions about the Middle East were so dramatically and wildly wrong, I expect this US report that says it's stalemate, reality is going to show that the absolute opposite is true. And we're going to see a very dynamic couple of months. Look to Belarus, because I think that is one of the shakiest cards in this very sort of wobbling deck of cards that Putin has built. We'll leave it there. I think this is a great format, so hopefully we will we'll reconvene on this to examine further changes in a couple of weeks' time. For now, I'm massively grateful to you all for joining me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Nice to see you guys.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you guys, and Mesa, let's hook up. And Jonathan, from one Jonathan to another, I appreciate everything you do, mate. Well done.